This individual had been transported to the imaginary realm he had perpetually envisioned. He believed he would obtain an advantage akin to every other transmigrator and begin to navigate life effortlessly. However, he devoted 3 decades contending through one gore-drenched conflict after another. It was only at that moment that he abruptly understood that all he had undergone was simply the prelude to the narrative. The genuine narrative would not commence until the Academy segment. Even more lamentably, he failed to meet the criteria to be considered a secondary character. At that moment, he possessed merely a singular desire. He yearned to go back to Earth, the dwelling he had coveted day and night. Prior to his transformation, Kim Sun-woo had led an unremarkable life, dedicating each day to sitting before his computer, fully engrossed in gaming. He had developed a near obsession with a specific game. Each day, he examined every aspect it provided. Each time a fresh update was released, he would compose thousands of words assessing and critiquing it. He was thoroughly acquainted with the intricate dynamics between characters in the game and the geography of the entire land, back to front. He had even committed to memory the whereabouts of every concealed treasure and mythical relic. The whole gaming community ridiculed him for his fixation, leading to the suspension of his accounts one after the other. Nevertheless, he persistently refused to surrender. At last, he had ultimately fulfilled his desire and immersed himself in that realm for real. After surveying his surroundings, Kim Sun-woo concluded that his foremost concern was determining his location. However, he swiftly realized that he had transformed into a 4- or 5-year-old youngster, prompting him to attempt to invoke a status window. Regardless of how many times he shouted for it, nothing transpired. He remained motionless on the edge of the bed, his heart plummeting. No system interface had emerged. Nonetheless, he recognized that this was not a typical reincarnation narrative, so he remained relatively untroubled. Ultimately, he had perused innumerable tales of this nature, and many individuals ventured into alternate realms without acquiring a status interface. After he settled his emotions, he recognized that his most pressing issue was discovering a method to generate income. In the initial week of his 4th year in this form, he ultimately discovered that he was now recognized as Ivan Petrovich. Ivan's guardians were destitute tenant cultivators. Neither of them possessed the ability to read, nor could they even identify the nation they resided in. Consequently, he attempted to produce soap as his escape from destitution, only to meet with utter failure. After recklessly experimenting with caustic lye, he endured a severe reprimand and punishment from his mother. It was only afterward that he realized soap was already available in this realm. In the 6th week of his 4th year in this form, he ventured into the village to purchase eggs and unexpectedly stumbled upon a newspaper. As he attentively scrutinized it, and he understood that if published content could arrive at such an isolated hamlet, this could not be an antiquated medieval society. He then retrieved the compilation of potential narratives he could have been thrust into. The majority of the titles had already been eliminated. By the 15th week of his 4th year in this form, he had ultimately discovered the titles of the nation and its monarch. Ultimately shredded each leftover sheet of the roster and incinerated them to cinders. He had never been acquainted with this nation, its monarch, or any of the adjoining states. However, determining to which narrative this realm was associated held less significance than uncovering the nature of his potential for deceit. At the age of 8, 4 years subsequent to assuming control of Ivan's form, a tremendous calamity unexpectedly occurred. The Infernal Legion initiated a comprehensive assault, and innumerable fiends and aerial dragons surged across the terrain. His mother tugged him back and commanded him to remain precisely in his position. In the meantime, a draft officer aggressively seized his father and pulled him away. Prior to departing, the man vowed that he would come back unharmed. Ivan could do nothing but observe powerless as his father was taken and dispatched to a perilous front line. From that point forward, his perception of identity gradually started to distort. At the age of 10, he and his mother relied completely on one another, and he had acquired expertise in all aspects of agricultural labor. By 12, he had ultimately achieved proficiency in the written script of this realm. At the age of 14, catastrophic news arrived at their residence. His father's formal death announcement had ultimately come. The harsh irony lay in the fact that the notification had been released 2 years prior. Ivan clasped the paper firmly and pondered what type of reality this genuinely was. This mythical realm possessed black powder and steam machinery. However, it also featured knights, sorcerers, and a malevolent sovereign. To make matters worse, the conflicts perpetually persisted. The revelation caused his whole body to shake uncontrollably. As his thoughts faded entirely, his mother concealed her face and succumbed to tears, weeping as the droplets cascaded through her hands. Ivan merely remained beside her in silence. After a brief pause, he inhaled deeply and softly reassured his mother that there was no cause for concern. The following day, Ivan embarked on a train and resolved to join the military. His yearly remuneration amounted to merely 15 copper coins, and each time he was paid, he dispatched every single coin back to his mother. This was not wholly an expression of familiarity familial loyalty. He merely felt compassion for the woman who had devoted her entire existence laboring tirelessly for him. He also experienced remorse for inhabiting the original Ivan's physique. Ultimately, Ivan was his mother's sole source of emotional solace. At the age of 18, in his 4th year of service, Ivan realized that his physique harbored an exceptional aptitude for warfare. He garnered numerous military accolades, ascending from a mere recruit to a seasoned soldier. However, the front line rapidly experienced a catastrophic breakdown, and the inferno of conflict engulfed all that surrounded them. As the entire battlefield teetered on the brink of annihilation, a champion unexpectedly emerged. In that instant, Ivan finally grasped the situation. This was a quintessential tale of a champion vanquishing the Dark Overlord and rescuing the realm. The hero's emergence offered them a flicker of optimism, yet Ivan's position continued to falter. Colossal, malevolent insects erupted from the ground, compelling his troops to withdraw repeatedly. The momentum ultimately shifted when the protagonist's group confronted the leaders of the Dark Lord's forces. After amassing numerous military victories, Ivan ultimately secured the chance to battle alongside the champion's group. The full designation of the unit was the Occupied Territory Control and Adversary Annihilation Unit. However, it was commonly referred to as the Annihilation Unit. Armed with 2 axes, Ivan positioned himself among heaps of bodies and streams of blood, mercilessly dispatching his foes without a pause. Once the hero's group eliminated the opposing commander, the whole enemy encampment descended into turmoil. Subsequently, the Annihilation Unit received orders to scour the camp and eradicate every lingering danger. 2 additional years flew by in an instant. Ivan celebrated his 30th birthday, signifying his 26th year in this form and his 16th year in military service. Ultimately, the band of heroes triumphed in vanquishing the demon sovereign. While the whole city rejoiced, Ivan silently lingered for the tale to reach its finale. He was convinced he could finally break free from this tormenting existence. However, even 2 years following the demise of the demon monarch, the seat of power remained unoccupied, and the narrative had yet to culminate in the conclusion he had anticipated. By that time, the conquering force had diminished to 1/5 of its initial magnitude. Ivan became aware that the superiors planned to systematically dissolve the remaining troops. Thus, he accomplished one last assignment from which he scarcely emerged unscathed. Subsequently, he willingly requested his release, yearning for this excruciatingly prolonged conclusion to finally reach its closure. But for 30 years, Ivan had inhabited this form, and his mother had passed away a decade ago. Nevertheless, the church bells persisted in ringing at their appointed times each day. He returned to the city of his youth that he had departed from many years prior. Yet, there was no one remaining by his side. At that moment, he found himself in front of St. Vasoisa orphanage, which he had established on the fringes of the metropolis. Nevertheless, even at that moment, the concluding credits he had anticipated still failed to materialize. Ivan intensely longed for the place he had formerly called home. The profound nostalgia was almost pushing him to the brink of madness. The Dark Ruler had been deceased for 4 years, so when would the conclusion ultimately come? Surely, he was not anticipated to linger until the champion perished of natural causes, before this tale genuinely reached its finale. At that moment, Ivan noticed a subtle noise in the vicinity. He recognized those steps all too clearly. The rustle of leather, the subtle aroma of gunpowder, and the unwavering cadence of each stride indicated that a meticulously trained warrior was nearing. Ivan swiftly reinforced his hold on the war axe at his side, and his stare became frigid. The door was softly eased open. A youthful officer stepped in with a grin and lifted a hand in greeting. "Superior, it's been quite a while." Ivan lifted his axe and motioned for the man to be direct. After a short pause, Ivan ultimately lowered his firearm and requested an explanation for his presence. The young officer presented him with a missive sealed with crimson wax. Ivan identified its source instantly. This was a personal correspondence composed by the princess herself. Following receiving the letter and settling onto the sofa, Ivan nonchalantly inquired if it held any toxins. The princess commenced the correspondence by casually inquiring about his well-being. However, Elisaveta Kirovna Krasilova, the princess referred to as iron-blooded Liza, would never dispatch a personal correspondence simply for the sake of friendly banter. Dmitri confessed that the circumstances had turned circumstances critical and the military regime persisted in critical, and the milited in insisting on the withdrawal of forces. In the meantime, Crown Prince Alexander was surreptitiously scheming to fragment the entire nation into 5 sections and auction them off. Regarding the monarch, he simply lingered in front of the chart, scarcely more than a symbolic presence. And, in the midst of this political turmoil, the country's most esteemed institution was on the verge of stepping into the spotlight. Dmitri subsequently inquired if Ivan was aware of the individuals who would be joining the academy as new students and instructors. The initial was Isabel, offspring of the champion Maximilian. The second was Oscar, offspring of the knight Gilles Welt. Additionally, there was Elfahara, progeny of the archmage Bjorgren. Echides, offspring of the berserker Einar, and Lucia, apprentice of the rogue Enrique, would likewise be present. The heirs of the champions who vanquished the demon's sovereign were convening in a single location. Even Saintess Patricia, a participant from the former Heroes Coalition, would be entering the academy as its new department head. The institution imposed no age limitations, and exceptionally talented youths from various regions of the nation were getting ready to register ahead of schedule. These valiant heirs also held remarkable symbolic significance. Should any of them perish, the entire nation would be plunged into turmoil. Upon hearing this, Ivan scowled and inquired of Dmitri precisely what task he was anticipated to carry out. Dmitri raised 3 fingers and instructed him to safeguard those children for a complete 3 years, without permitting any of them to encounter harm. After contemplating for a brief while, Ivan pondered how this could genuinely be regarded as the conclusion of a champion's narrative. The champion had vanquished the demon's sovereign, yet there was no tranquil, joyous resolution. Rather, the nation was beset by political unrest, strained international relations, and an institution that had seemingly materialized from thin air. A revelation hit Ivan with the force of a thunderclap, rendering him immobile. My goodness, could it truly be? A chilling thought abruptly crossed his mind. Ivan leaped to his feet and pressed both hands against the table, his body quivering slightly. His fingers sank into the edge with such force that the veins on the backs of his hands swelled. The genuine progression of this narrative unfolded in an educational segment, astonished by Ivan's abrupt response. Dmitri swiftly inquired about the issue. Ivan merely whispered to himself, "What sort of jest is this? I toiled in this realm for 3 decades, only to realize that every torment I faced was merely the introduction." However, if that were indeed the situation, Ivan ultimately understood what actions he needed to take. He merely had to safeguard these youngsters until they completed their education. Upon that understanding, Ivan promptly embraced the assignment. The princess's missive rested unsealed upon the table, commencing with the phrase, "Ivan, have you been faring well?" She reflected on the moments they had devoted to nurturing the garden collaboratively, and conveyed her desire that they might one day enjoy tea and converse once more. The cold season was drawing near again, and this year's winter anticipated to be more frigid and isolating than ever prior. A palm softly caressed the desiccated limbs, each motion imbued with a persistent feeling of melancholy. In the correspondence, the princess confessed that Ivan was the individual she relied on the most. Should Ivan ever request anything from her, she vowed to compensate him 3 times over. She would never violate that commitment, and she would leverage their camaraderie to atone for all she owed him. If even that was insufficient to settle her obligation, she was prepared to relinquish every recollection they had together as the cost. The realm continued to require Ivan's assistance, just as it perpetually had. The correspondence concluded with warmest regards, Kirilovna. Seated solitary in his office, Ivan quietly concluded perusing the complete correspondence. In straightforward terms, Ivan was tasked with safeguarding the offspring of the champions group for the ensuing 3 years, guaranteeing that none of them perished prior to completing their university education. The genuine primary narrative of this realm revolved around the academy arc. If Ivan could persevere for an additional 3 years and experience the conclusion, he would ultimately be able to return to Earth. Ivan then inquired of Dmitri who would embark first. Dmitri responded that it would be Ana's offspring. As soon as Ivan detected the mention of that lunatic Inar, his heart constricted. Inar, now esteemed as Emperor Drone, was formerly a participant in the preceding champions group. Ivo still clearly recalled him wielding a colossal axe on the battleground, his gaze radiating a fierce crimson as he decimated all that stood before him. Furthermore, the initial pupil making her way to the academy was none other than the offspring of that savage warrior. At the railway terminal, the drone knights roared with exuberance, proclaiming that the maiden who possessed the lineage of Inar the Conqueror was fated to triumph over all. The nearby audience hummed with enthusiasm as whispers suggested that the domain she aimed to master was orchestral music. With her device secured on her back, the youngsters marched onto the train, resolute in her quest to demonstrate her abilities to all. She would secure her position in the orchestral music division at St. Yanks University's School of Music. The drone knights offered her a magnificent farewell. 2 days later, the train arrived at Snow Mountain Bridge. A thunderous detonation abruptly shattered the silence. The locomotive burst into flames, propelling a column of fire upward into the atmosphere. Dmitri promptly conveyed that the train had endured a terrorist assault. Ivan's forehead creased as he swiftly sought verification that the account was accurate. Ivan remained quiet in the hallway, already comprehending that this had to be an orchestrated occurrence in an academy narrative. The introductory segment alone endured for 3 decades. In a classic hero's narrative, the champion and his allies would collaborate to vanquish the Dark Sovereign. Even a few of their past adversaries would ultimately switch allegiance to the hero's camp. Upon the conclusion of the conflict, the globe would ultimately embrace an era of tranquility tranquility. That was the conclusion anticipated by all. Ivan had thought that the savage conflict that commenced 3 decades ago was merely a relic of the past. However, everything had simply served as a precursor to the subsequent tale. An assault on a train headed to the academy at Igorvich Station was precisely the type of quintessential introductory incident that an academy narrative would employ. At this moment, Ivan lounged in the waiting area perusing a newspaper, fully aware of what was about to unfold. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, and the locomotive transporting Princess Aikides was about to reach the terminal. If anyone aiming to assault the princess would find this secluded frontier outpost an ideal location to orchestrate an ambush. If the assailants aimed to implicate the realm, there was no more advantageous location to launch their assault. As Ivan possessed no tangible proof, he had not sought any additional support. He stood upright and surveyed the almost empty waiting area. One individual continually examined the schedule, even though he had already let 3 trains depart without getting on. His actions were quite dubious. A produce seller was also observing the tranquil countryside station. It was unlikely that anyone would visit this place to purchase vegetables, yet the man lingered by his stand, nonchalantly smoking. Ivan began approaching the individual who had frequently examined the schedule. He unsheathed his firearm and positioned the muzzle against the nape of the man's neck. The man instantly started quaking, icy perspiration streaming down his brow. Ivan calmly instructed him to stay quiet, without shifting the firearm even a fraction. The man's 2 associates observed that something was amiss and swiftly darted towards Ivan. From the periphery of his vision, Ivan glanced at his ankle. The man's physique entirely obscured the firearm from sight. Nevertheless, Ivan opted to confirm one final detail. He icily inquired, "Where does your allegiance reside?" The individual faltered, incapable of responding. Ivan promptly squeezed the trigger, discharging a round through his skull and splattering crimson across the ground. That validated it. These individuals were neither reinforcements nor royal representatives. They were all affiliates of the same terrorist organization. The last 2 were overcome with fear and unsheathed their firearms, bracing themselves for a battle to the end. Ivan pivoted to the side to evade their gunfire, then swiftly narrowed the gap. His sword gleamed, swiftly slashing open the throat of one individual. The last assailant continued to resist capitulation. Ivan swung his sword and cleaved the man's arm. As the metal sliced through tissue, the assailant crumpled to the ground with a shriek. They were present, merely a collection of miserable novices. It is evident that none of them have ever encountered a genuine force to be reckoned with. The collapsed extremist grasped and yelled, "My arm, my arm." Ivan icily cautioned him, "If you don't staunch the flow, you'll be lifeless in 3 minutes. So begin speaking. Where are the remaining members of your confederacy?" Upon hearing this, the extremist wept uncontrollably and pleaded for clemency. He disclosed that 15 additional individuals were concealed near the railway, asserting that he was merely an expendable, insignificant figure. Armed with that intelligence, Ivan concluded that these individuals were simply a sophisticated scouting unit. After a brief pause, Ivan swung his sword downward. It was currently 9:53 a.m., and Ivan gazed at the station's colossal timepiece. The sanitation crew would require 5 minutes to eliminate all remains and blood marks from the reception area. By the time they completed their task, it would be 9:58, allowing merely 2 minutes before the train arrived at the station. However, for Ivan, 2 minutes was ample time. Not. Many moments later, Ivan observed the locomotive fade away into the horizon. Then he sprang into the boundless expanse of snow, as the conventions of any academic narrative stipulated that a train assault would never result in the demise of the main character or a significant figure. Princess Akiti remained entirely unscathed within her compartment. The locomotive, the assault on the brink of registration, was merely a preliminary phase. The assailants initiating gunfire and inciting a conflict only functioned as a rehearsal exercise intended to assist the protagonist in acclimating to the circumstances. Subsequently, one of the outlaws activated the detonator. A resounding detonation reverberated across the snow-covered expanse. In reality, Ivan had never aimed to thwart the assault. Ultimately, the introductory phase needed to be completed by the narrative's genuine main character. At that instant, the chieftain of the marauders erupted in laughter and commanded his followers to plunder the train. Ivan's genuine aim was to reveal the entity responsible for the assault. This identical faction would subsequently penetrate the academy, only to be utterly annihilated. Ivan surged ahead, resolute in his efforts to avert the situation from developing into a comprehensive conflict. As he initiated a reconnaissance mission beyond adversarial boundaries, he unsheathed his firearm and commenced neutralizing the dangers concealed in the vicinity. The moment had arrived. Ivan squeezed the trigger, launching a bullet hurtling through the atmosphere. The locomotive detonated in a tremendous blast, and dense dark fumes surged into the atmosphere. A cluster of outlaws congregated around the debris and shouted with enthusiasm, "We're about to strike it rich." There, the commander instructed them to remove the royal insignia insignias from the gold prior to selling all the items on the illicit market. However, by that time, Ivan had silently drawn near to them. He discharged a round into one criminal's skull, splattering blood in all directions. The abrupt gunfire instantly alerted the rest. The marauders were thrown into a frenzy and anxiously scoured the vicinity. However, from the perspective of the genuine force, succumbing to chaos following an ambush was the unmistakable conduct of the feeble. A hairless marauder bellowed and inquired about the identity of those who had assaulted them. That response alone demonstrated that none of them had awareness of the shooting line. Observing this, Ivan lifted his firearm and cautiously stepped out from the dense haze. He glared icily at the hairless individual and inquired, "Are you the chief here?" In response, the man brandished his firearm and discharged it. Ivan promptly veered to the side, evading the trajectory of the projectiles as his stare became frigid. He initiated firing line awareness, causing the path of each projectile to become distinctly visible before him. When a combatant attained a specific degree of power, conventional weaponry became almost ineffective against them. Projectiles and armaments emanated lethal intent that exposed their wielder's location. This lethal intent enveloped the assailant like unseen strands, and Ivan was able to perceive each one distinctly. A combatant wielding a weapon might harness mana to mask its lethal intent. However, once projectiles such as bullets and arrows were launched, obscuring their existence became nearly unfeasible. That was the reason the elite fighters in the champions group rarely utilized firearms. The elimination squad, however, stood apart. Each member wielded a handgun. They frequently employed weaponry to assess an adversary's power while disposing of minor nuisances. This was one of the routine strategies employed by the extermination unit. At that instant, the outlaw chief brandished his sword and struck directly at Ivan. Ivan thwarted the assault with a single hand, and the forceful collision itself caused the marauder to howl in agony. Ivan promptly retaliated with a strike to the man's torso. The strike sent the bandit chief crashing forcefully into the earth. Then, the man clenched his jaws and vowed that he would etch Ivan's visage into his memory and come back for retribution one day. Ivan simply gazed down at him from his elevated position. This individual was evidently the leader of the instructional phase. As a result, he was an adversary designated to combat the central character, but Ivan opted not to eliminate him. Ivan secured his firearm and cautioned the individual to respond to each inquiry honestly. In the meantime, Echides positioned herself outside the residence and emphatically proclaimed that she would permit no one to. Grasping her hand, she cautioned her father that if she noticed anyone clandestinely trailing her, she would sever all connections with them permanently. Positioned behind her, Inar became lost in contemplation. At that moment, a sudden burst of inspiration engulfed him. As long as Echides remained unaware of the individual trailing her, there would be no issue. Inar promptly called upon his troops and detailed the circumstances. He elevated his tone and inquired, "Which among you can achieve complete invisibility and discreetly safeguard Echides?" A contingent of hulking, brawny men instantly replied in harmony. They had previously existed as ruthless assassins, yet following their lord's acceptance, they vowed to regard one another as kin. Inar still appeared uneasy. "Echides is familiar with each of your visages. Even if you embark on the train in disguise, she will identify you instantly." Then, his eyes abruptly grew wide. "Which among you possesses the ability to pursue a swiftly moving train solely on foot?" The warriors replied in harmony once more. They desired neither wealth nor accolades, pledging to their lord only their steadfast allegiance. Across Drowin, they were recognized as the Jarlsguard or the Haskarls. Inar then gestured with his hand and instructed anyone assured of succeeding in the written entrance examination to lift their hand. The fighters cast apprehensive looks at one another, deeming the demand utterly ridiculous. They would prefer to rush into a combat zone and perish than undertake a written assessment. At that moment, a colossal hand gradually ascended into the sky. The gentleman lifted his arm high over his head. "My lord, I am capable of taking the examination." This sentinel was more Erickson. The other fighters instantly burst into applause. "Don't fret, sibling. What significance does it hold how challenging the inquiries are?" Inar was elated. "Outstanding, sibling. Depart immediately. From this day onward, you are a novice in the faculty of physical training." Moore bellowed his reply and lifted a hand in acknowledgement. "Indeed, sir. I vow on my life that I shall safeguard Echides." As it was revealed that an individual had covertly penetrated the academy 2 months prior. Defying all predictions, he successfully completed the entrance examination with an admirable overall score and gained admission to the Department of Physical Education. Naturally, his written score had just surpassed the threshold, and his complete answer sheet was a disordered jumble. Every assessor who reviewed his responses was rendered utterly voiceless. However, Moore obliterated the Academy's practical assessment record, showcasing an astonishingly formidable physique. Undoubtedly, he was the sentinel dispatched to penetrate the Academy. Then, one day in January, a ferocious detonation abruptly reverberated throughout the snow-covered expanse. Moore had expended 2 days and two knights racing tirelessly to catch up with the train. The freshly admitted physical education student pursued it, shouting at the peak of his voice, "Echi, hold on for me." In the meantime, the train compartment was trembling fiercely. Echides nestled in a corner and inquired anxiously, "What's going on? Did marauders assault us?" She was consumed by remorse. She had explicitly prohibited any of her attendants from accompanying her, and now she found herself without a single protector at her side. An abrupt sound caused Echides to startle once more. She swiftly clutched her violin to her chest. What a relief it was that the instrument had remained unharmed. Echides lacked the opportunity to comprehend the unfolding events. A thunderous impact reverberated through the carriage, and the ceiling was shattered. The view rendered her quaking, her visage suffused with dread. A hand gradually materialized from the fog, accompanied by a sinister chuckle. A group of marauders leaped through the gap and scrutinized the young woman with ravenous smiles. In the meantime, Ivan had the chief of the marauders restrained under his heel. He icily remarked, "Don't fret, you won't perish just now." Ivan gradually elevated his axe. "Calm down, I'm about to demonstrate what it feels like to long for death." An instant later, a chilling shriek reverberated throughout the vicinity. Ivan subsequently revealed a container brimming with emerald liquid. The chief of the bandits instantly shrieked in fright, "Halt, anything but that. I will disclose everything." Ivan did not allow him to complete his statement before drenching the elixir straight onto his injury. What did frontline troops despise the most? Their provisions, their superiors, their fellow soldiers, their adversaries, and naturally, restorative elixirs. The emerald fluid sizzled upon contact with the injury, causing the bandit chief to scream in torment. It was a form of agony that could solely be comprehended through personal experience. At that time, a nurse had gently cautioned Ivan, urging him to refrain from making such drastic statements. Should you persist in your turmoil, your injury might escalate to the point of necessitating amputation. Sir, your existence holds immense worth to the country. But Ivan had bellowed in response. Who in their right mind would desire a treasure that inflicts such torment upon individuals? Ivan had initially stumbled upon this elixir during his naive formative days in the military. The elixir compelled its wielder to endure, simultaneously, every fragment of agony that would typically accompany the gradual recovery process. Its container was labeled R7. Upon experiencing its impacts directly, Ivan uncovered an alternative application for it, one that his associates in the domination unit utterly loathed. He was capable of mending a detainee's wounds, persisting with the questioning, and subsequently reiterating the procedure without end. It was the ideal approach to interrogation. The outlaw chief collapsed onto his knees, shaking uncontrollably. He maintained that he possessed no further details and pleaded with Ivan to take his life. Ivan disregarded his entreaties. This individual had to survive. He was likely the leader of the introductory phase, so there was no justification for his execution. Ivan intentionally pulled him all the way to the train, yet the man could not recall who had masterminded the assault. Evidently, he was merely a minor piece in the game. His eyes abruptly constricted as a thought struck him. Had someone cast a mental barrier enchantment on this individual? In that instant, a formidable surge of lethal intent surged toward him. Ivan turned his head to the side, anticipating the trajectory of the assault before it reached him. He gazed up at the ceiling of the train. Was the adversary targeting the space between his brows? No. A colossal rock plummeted from above, aimed squarely at Ivan's visage. Ivan swiftly sidestepped, and the rock detonated a massive hollow in the earth. His adversary had intentionally opted not to assault with a weapon, and anyone proficient in hurling a boulder with such magnitude was considerably more powerful than Ivan had expected. A series of thunderous explosions resonated, while dense plumes of dust enveloped the combat zone. An instant later, Ivan gradually appeared from the haze, emanating an oppressive surge of lethal intent. If that were true, then his adversary must also possess acute awareness of their surroundings. Ivan commandingly instructed, "Reveal yourself." A colossal man with fiery red hair emerged from the haze, exuding a sinister aura with each movement. "You possess considerable skill," he remarked, then glared menacingly at Ivan and bellowed, "I can't fathom that you had the audacity to touch my niece." Upon hearing this, Ivan slightly squinted his eyes. It appeared that his assessment had been erroneous. This individual was not the leader of the tutorial phase, but rather a relative of the leader. Ivan grasped his war axe with both hands and promptly adopted a combat posture. Azure energy radiated around his form. "I recommend you comprehend the circumstances you're in." Moore unleashed a resounding bellow and lifted both axes high over his head. He struck them with all his might, compelling Ivan to evade to the side. At that instant, even Ivan was truly astonished. This individual possessed remarkable strength. When Ivan intercepted the subsequent strike with his axe, the force rendered both of his hands tingling. Moore twirled his dual tomahawks, their edges etching lines of icy illumination through the atmosphere. Ivan had been convinced that this was merely a preliminary phase. Had his forecasts somehow been mistaken? Was this individual genuinely employing such immense power solely solely to heist a train, or was another entity orchestrating everything from the shadows. The two engaged in a relentless exchange of strikes, and with each passing moment of their struggle, Ivan grew increasingly apprehensive. Their blades collided once more, generating a shrill metallic sound. What neither individual comprehended was that they were both battling with every ounce of strength they possessed to safeguard the kittens. Abruptly, a thunderous bang erupted from the locomotive as the carriage ceiling fragmented once more. Within, a marauder cautiously advanced towards Etchai, brandishing a weapon aloft. The outlaw smirked malevolently. "I assumed you were merely a typical survivor. I never anticipated you would possess such allure." Etchai sprang to her feet and softly murmured, "I apologize," to her cherished violin. She then lifted the instrument and struck it forcefully against the marauder. The vehicle abruptly plunged into turmoil as the strike propelled the outlaw tumbling rearward. The lingering marauders exchanged apprehensive looks, coming to the realization that the circumstances had abruptly escalated in complexity. Etchai strengthened her hold on the violin and glowered fiercely at the men encircling her. Tears welled in her eyes. "You caused pain to Connie. This is inexcusable. Connie is the violin that has accompanied me for 2 entire years." Etchai bore a striking resemblance to her mother in numerous aspects, yet her father was Einar the Butcher, the fierce warrior who had previously dispatched his foes with a colossal axe. Now, Etchai clenched her teeth as the might of her lineage started to stir. Recognizing that something was amiss, the marauders became frantic and called for everyone to withdraw. Yet Etchai bounded into the sky and elevated her violin high above her head. "Connie, I shall seek retribution for you." At that instant, the globe's most powerful musical girl made her official entrance. One outlaw was hurled away, while the other shrieked in fright. Simultaneously, Moore and Ivan ceased their battle and directed their attention to the train. They both spoke simultaneously. "What transpired with Etchides? Is my niece secure?" The two men gazed at one another, with mirrored looks of astonishment manifesting on their countenances. Moore abruptly dropped his weapons and retreated. Recalling the restorative elixir from earlier, he understood that the individual standing before him had never inflicted any harm on his niece. Concurrently, a well-known principle of narrative emerged in Ivan's thoughts. Within an academy tale, a train heist could never claim the life of the main character. Some figure would invariably materialize to rectify the predicament. Moore swiftly inquired, "Hold on, aren't you collaborating with these outlaws?" Ivan gestured with his arms. "I have no clue what led you to that assumption. The elixir I applied to that marauder's injury is a technique employed by the elimination squad for questioning." Upon hearing this, Moore took a long breath and gradually started to compose himself. At that moment, Etchides appeared from the carriage. Her eyes shone with a crimson hue, and she continued to grasp her violin tightly. Moore hurried towards her with enthusiasm. "Niece, are you okay?" Ivan remained still, positioned to the side. He had encountered Etchides previously, 7 years prior. In his recollections, she had frozen in time as a young girl who gazed up at him and endearingly referred to him as uncle. There was a possibility that she might remember him. Fortunately, the individual Ivan was required to safeguard was secure, and Moore was evidently robust enough to accompany her to the academy. Abruptly, Etchides pivoted in the direction of the spot where Ivan had been positioned. She gazed at Moore and inquired inquisitively, "Uncle, was there not another person present just moments ago?" Moore momentarily stiffened, but swiftly regained his poise. He reflected on the recent altercation and recognized that the individual's methods were remarkably similar to those employed by the Krasilov elite forces. His approach with an axe appeared remarkably reminiscent, bearing a strong likeness to the methods employed by brother Einar. There was but one individual who had been under Krasilov's tutelage and acquired axe techniques from Einar. That individual was Ivan. Moore caressed his chin and inquired of Etchides, "Do you recall an individual named Ivan?" The young lady softly echoed Ivan's name before promptly affirming with a nod. She gazed at the descending sun. He was an exceptionally kind and remarkably proficient individual. As for his level of composure, that's challenging to determine. However, I was informed that he passed away 2 years prior. Furthermore, he seldom groomed himself, so even if I encountered him again, I might not identify him, not at all. Much later, Ivan cast his eyes down to the papers he held. The document verified that Etchides had securely arrived at her location. Subsequently, Oscar, the offspring of the knight Gilles Welt, was set to leave the Kingdom of Tyres in the coming days. Elfihara, the offspring of Archmage Bjorgren, would arrive via airship, whereas Enrique's apprentice Lucia had already made her way into the royal metropolis. Ivan shut the document and smiled. Nearly all the individuals who are required to be present have at last shown up. As everyone would shortly congregate at the academy, Ivan resolved to concentrate on his primary obligation. He commenced enumerating the dishes he yearned to savor upon his return to Earth, positioning kimchi stew at the pinnacle. As the roster expanded, Ivan's enthusiasm intensified. His pen was on the verge of perforating the page. No, there were also zesty rice cakes. Ideally, he would enjoy kimchi soup and zesty rice cakes simultaneously. As Ivan became became entirely engrossed in his daydreams about cuisine, he detected an abrupt sound emanating from behind him. He whirled around. A young girl was grasping the exterior of the window, beaming at him. Without a moment's pause, Ivan extended his arm and pulled her in. "How on earth did you manage to ascend here? Do you possess a desire for self-destruction? This is the third level." Ivan exhaled in despair, swung the door ajar, and ventured out. The children's home featured a vintage game known as Stealthily Approach the Director without being detected. In the corridor, the cluster of youngsters glanced out from behind the partitions. This small pastime had gained immense popularity among them. Abruptly, a lad leaped from a wooden cask and hurled an object at Ivan. Ivan's stare immediately intensified. Without even glancing back, he lifted one hand and effortlessly intercepted the item hurtling towards him from the rear. The lad emerged from the cask and stood still in bewilderment. He was baffled by how Ivan succeeded in intercepting everything hurled at him from behind. Ivan subsequently bent down and hoisted the child into his embrace. He positioned the youngster atop his shoulders. Despite Ivan's formidable demeanor, he was, in fact, rather laid back. Observing this, the other youngsters swiftly converged around him, chattering enthusiastically over one another. Ivan realized that if these children ever acquired the ability to evade his awareness, they would be able to thrive autonomously wherever they ventured. Only 2 weeks remained before the forthcoming cohort of valiant heirs embarked on their journey. However, the circumstance was considerably more intricate than Ivan had anticipated. In the late hours of the night, Priscilla found herself bound to a chair as 2 burly men wielding wooden bats encircled her. The men scowled intensely and inquired, "Who instructed you in that covert skill?" Priscilla lifted her gaze and proclaimed Ivan's complete name with great volume: Ivan Petrovich. The pair of men momentarily halted. Ivan. An instant later, they erupted in mirth, following. In Krasilov, Ivan stood out as one of the most prevalent first names, whereas Petrovich emerged as one of the most frequent last names. However, one individual's chuckling suddenly ceased, as if he had unexpectedly come to a realization. He icily inquired, "Who did he just mention instructed you in that covert method?" Noticing the abrupt shift in the man's demeanor, Priscilla went ghostly white and her lips started to quiver. In the meantime, Ivan lingered at the entrance of the orphanage, firmly clutching Priscilla's jacket. 2 sisters of the convent hurried towards him in distress and conveyed that Priscilla had been abducted. Ivan glanced at the material in his grasp and observed a faint cross-shaped incision. It represented the emblem of that woman's group. She was the final individual Ivan wished to encounter, yet evading her was no longer a feasible choice. Several years prior, the woman had proclaimed her withdrawal from active duty, only to clandestinely form a covert assassination squad. She was none other than the Shadowblade champion, Enrique. Ivan now descended into the subterranean prison that Enrique had meticulously crafted. However, even he was astonished by what he discovered within. Years previously, a commemorative monument and multiple sculptures had been located in the heart of Frichinkaya's main garden. However, one day following the Demon King's conquest and the conclusion of the conflict, the statue of the anonymous hero at the core of the garden inexplicably disappeared. Only Enrique had the capability to extricate a complete statue from the core of the royal metropolis without encountering any repercussions. Return. Subsequently, a timber tablet alongside the sculpture had inscribed, "It is my prerogative to grieve for them." Ultimately, Enrique had previously been a part of the champion's entourage. Individuals of their ilk were weapons too keen for an era of tranquility. The eradication squad had been compelled to dissolve, which likely explained why Enrique had pilfered the sculpture. Ivan gradually neared the foot of the monument. He softly inquired, "Has this engraving consistently existed here?" As he gazed at the pair of columns of names, Ivan smirked wryly to himself. Thus, this was the reality. He shut his eyes and uttered in a soft tone, "There is no necessity to grieve for those who departed prior to us. Since my name is etched alongside theirs." The earth abruptly trembled, and a slender fissure appeared beneath the sculpture. A concealed corridor, extending into the depths below, emerged in front of Ivan. His whole physique immediately stiffened as a tremendous surge of lethal intent emanated from him. Within a tastefully adorned chamber, a lady occupied the distant end of a garden table, contentedly enjoying a cup of tea. She icily commented, "I'm astonished you still recall the past." She set her cup down and proceeded with, "It has been 7 years since we last encountered each other, little Ivan." 100 years prior, she had wielded her status as a champion to quell the Frichinkaya vampire rebellion. However, she was simultaneously a vampire who had claimed innumerable lives through covert assassination agreements. She was simultaneously the creator of the eradication unit and Ivan's previous mentor. Enrique grinned, "Young Ivan, you haven't taken a sip of her coffee. Are you concerned that I might have tainted it? If you prolong it any further, it will become chilly." Ivan utterly disregarded her and insisted on finding out where Priscilla was located. The edge of Enrique's lips twisted upward. "Refrain from posing the inquiry in that manner. It gives off an impression of inexperience." Ivan's. His physique tensed, and his his murderous intent started to surge forth uncontrollably. Enrique gently reminded him, "Young Ivan, I instructed you that thoughtlessly exposing your lethal intent is a behavior reserved for the hunted. Refrain from. Do not fret, I haven't harmed the child, and she is receiving excellent care." In the following moment, a fierce surge of murderous intent emanated from Enrique and surged towards Ivan. She regarded him with a frosty gaze. "Young Ivan, it's now your moment to respond to my inquiries. What precisely are you scheming? And what is the reason for amassing so numerous orphans? Upon learning that you began to take in orphans following your retirement, I found it quite uplifting. Yet, in just 2 years, you cultivated an operative proficient in elimination and dispatched her to infiltrate my residence. How does that differ from brazenly challenging me at my own threshold? Did you arrive here to provoke a confrontation on my grounds? I sincerely hoped we could engage in an orderly discussion. However, that facial hair of yours is making me go crazy. You are still donning garments from 100 years past, and now you've adorned yourself with a counterfeit beard. What is amiss with you? Please don't claim that this is meant to be a plausible disguise. I summoned you here without the desire for confrontation. Nonetheless, you're behaving as if you'll attempt to eliminate me at the slightest contact. Ivan abruptly squinted as his thoughts surged. What precisely had Enrique just uttered? None of it registered with him. 4 years following the demise of the Demon King, the kingdom of Krasilov seemed tranquil on the exterior. Yet, beneath the surface, it had already fragmented into 2 prominent factions, where an intense battle for the crown was subtly taking shape. Crown Prince Alexander was resolute in instigating an external conflict, whereas Princess Elizaveta was exerting every effort to maintain tranquility within the realm. In order to avert a further conflict, the princess had reinstated an operative who had pretended to perish years prior. His objective was to guarantee that each pivotal individual enrolled in the academy and successfully finished their education. That operative was Ivan, so why was Enrique now insisting on uncovering his scheme? Henry ought to have realized that Ivan was executing Princess Elizaveta's assignment. Why persist in uncovering the specifics? Had she ceased backing the princess? A chilling thought abruptly invaded Ivan's consciousness. Had this woman betrayed him to crown Prince Alexander? If that is the case, what precisely was she intending? Ivan inhaled deeply and shifted the topic. I learned that you have mentored a protege who will soon be attending St. Yansky University. Henry lifted an eyebrow. Young Ivan, what are you attempting to convey? Ivan responded solemnly, my patron attributes immense significance to your apprentice. Should anything occur to that young one, the whole realm will endure the consequences. That is the reason my patron tasked me with safeguarding her. This was the task that Princess Elizaveta had entrusted to him. If Enrique had not aligned himself with Alexander, she ought to have grasped the implicit significance. However, Enrique perceived Ivan's remarks in an entirely distinct manner. She believed he was menacing her pupil. Enrique sprang to her feet as a chilling surge of malicious intent raced toward the ceiling. You scoundrel, you truly aimed for my student. She promptly faced the entrance and called out, Leisha, enter the house. An upbeat reply resonated from outside. Coming, master, a raven-haired girl announced as she swung the door open and beamed at Ivan. Mr. Petrovich, I've heard a great deal about you. Ivan, intrigued by the woman's perspective, inquired, are you human? If so, do you know what lineage your master belongs to? Lucia responded softly, certainly. My master is an ordinary individual. While her eating habits may be peculiar, she is a genuine hero safeguarding this realm. Furthermore, a person's lineage should be determined by their humanity. Ivan paused momentarily, contemplating Lucia's perception of her master. Since the conclusion of the conflict with the demons, the realm had persistently dismissed non-human races. Lucia's progressive ideals were exceptionally uncommon. Enrique gazed at Lucia. She embodies the utmost pride of my later years, surpassing any of us. That is precisely the reason I prefer not to battle you. Ivan offered a frosty grin and placed his hand on the firearm at his hip. It appears we are still unable to evade this. If you have decided to align with the opposing faction of the royal family, then I will be compelled to disregard our former camaraderie. So enlighten me, what did Alexander present to you? Existence, essence, or land? Enrique gazed at him in bewilderment. Hold on, aren't you the individual collaborating with Alexander? Ivan appeared just as astonished. What are you referring to? I have never extended my assistance to that individual. The ambience in the space abruptly turned excruciatingly uncomfortable. Enrique abruptly erupted in laughter, conversing with you as if it were draining. Fate is undeniably unjust. How did it acquire such adeptness in interaction? Ivan retrieved the coffee that had long turned tepid. Following such a fraught encounter, he nearly felt compelled to request extra compensation from Princess Elizaveta. Regardless, the confusion between them had ultimately been clarified. Ivan understood that even when the trial commenced, Enrique's apprentice would never encounter any mortal peril. Enrique would certainly safeguard her himself. Lucia was already an incoming pupil at St. Yank's University, whereas Ivan was officially recognized as one of the institution's educators. Considering, at the The duo, Ivan could scarcely fathom that they were mentor and pupil. They appeared much more akin to a mother and daughter. Once the gathering concluded, Ivan and Priscilla strolled for a considerable while. It was evident that they were nowhere close to the orphanage. Ivan gazed down at Priscilla and realized that she had intentionally ventured into the urban core. However, due to the softness of her footsteps, she had been misidentified as a highly skilled operative and apprehended. At that moment, Priscilla softly pulled at the hem of Ivan's jacket. She softly inquired, "Director, are you preparing to depart?" Officials had approached Ivan 2 years prior, and he had been actively managing the orphanage regularly in the past few weeks. Priscilla likely thought he intended to vanish indefinitely. It's possible that was not the sole concern weighing on her mind. The youngsters may have already discerned Ivan's motives. Ivan exhaled gently. "Indeed, I am getting ready to depart." Priscilla's eyes instantly became crimson. Dabbing at her tears, she wept. "If you depart, Director, we'll find ourselves isolated once more, remaining." Under the descending sun, Ivan ultimately comprehended. As a child of conflict, Priscilla was apprehensive that the refuge she had battled tirelessly to secure might vanish once more. This was the reason she had hurried into the urban core to seek an alternative path ahead. However, due to her ability to move silently, she had been apprehended as a presumed covert operative. Ivan placed the coat across Priscilla's shoulders, and she inquired about his intended destination. Ivan was unsure of how to respond. Ultimately, what he genuinely desired was to escape from this entire imaginary realm. After a brief contemplation, he gazed directly into her eyes. "I will be attending St. Yansek University. Rest assured, I will return and see everyone frequently. Furthermore, I am not departing right away, and I certainly won't be vanishing for good." Shortly thereafter, the youngsters convened within one of the orphanage's educational spaces. They initiated a substantial conversation. "I learned that the admission test for St. Yansek University is exceptionally challenging, and the forthcoming examination is scheduled for next November. This signifies that if we succeed, we will have the opportunity to encounter the director once more a year from now. Thus, the guidelines remain unchanged from prior occasions. We must ensure that the director does not uncover our activities. We must get ready without attracting attention. Whosoever gains admission to St. Yansek University triumphs." In the meantime, Ivan occupied his workspace perusing paperwork, a feigned grin forming on his lips. Everything was unfolding as intended. Equities, offspring of the late berserker champion Anner, safeguarding objective verified. Lucia, follower of Enrique, safeguarding objective verified. This indicated that the subsequent objective was Isabel, offspring of the champion Maximilian. In reality, the champions group had functioned as a clandestine execution squad. They focused on penetrating adversarial lands and accurately dispatching leaders within the Demon King's forces. Each undertaking required utmost discretion, yet during a particular mission, the hero unexpectedly raised his sword skyward. He gazed at the mark his blade had etched in the atmosphere, seemingly awestruck by his own martial prowess. Enrique's enraged tone instantly echoed, "Have you lost your senses?" That's far from unveiling the utmost aspiration of the entire realm. In the meantime, their comrade Gilles Welt initiated a ferocious sword onslaught. Dazzling golden radiance erupted throughout the combat zone, while he proclaimed with unwavering conviction that he simply could not be defeated. Numerous, intertwining currents of blade power nearly shattered the nocturnal heavens. Enrique was filled with dread and exclaimed, "That final strike almost broke your wrist. Quick, Patricia, tend to him." At that moment, the berserker Anner emitted a deep and malevolent chuckle. He bellowed at the peak of his voice, "The warriors of Drone are fated to etch their identities into this realm." An enormous scarlet streak abruptly ascended into the heavens and cleaved a remote peak asunder. Myriad creatures surged forth from the freshly created fissure and cascaded over the terrain. The demon lord's forces had transformed into an agitated hornet's nest, assembling into an enormous ebony cloud that obscured the entire heavens. Ivan could merely sprint for his survival, frantically evading the Demon King's forces and the Iron Dragon general pursuing him. The entire getaway had been utterly ludicrous, and the calamity had commenced when the champion Maximilian had abruptly cleaved the nocturnal heavens. That was Maximilian, an utterly absurd individual who consistently behaved contrary to reason. Gilles Welt promptly objected, vociferously asserting that he had dispersed significantly more clouds. Anna remained steadfast, contending that breaking something tangible was far more challenging than slicing through the ethereal atmosphere. Truthfully, the Champions Assembly was merely a congregation of eccentrics. Not a solitary individual among them could be considered ordinary, and the champion Maximilian was the most eccentric of them all. Nonetheless, he was also the most intelligent and enchanting individual in the entire ensemble. He had voluntarily revealed the gathering's whereabouts by tearing apart the nocturnal heavens solely because he desired to gaze at the stars. As Ivan observed him, and a singular notion permeated his thoughts, he had no fondness for this protagonist whatsoever. 4 years prior, Maximilian had personally slain the Demon King and brought the prolonged prolonged conflict to a close. Then, without warning, he vanished, severing all ties he held with the outside world. Nevertheless, the globe persisted in recalling the designation of the champion, while slowly overlooking the individual known as Maximilian. At that moment, Ivan found himself seated in a rapidly moving train when an individual next to him inquired if he was feeling ill. Ivan surveyed the compartment and discovered 5 individuals in matching attire gazing intently at him. He instantly recognized that difficulties had come. These individuals were clearly present because of him. Everything commenced when Ivan stepped in during the assault aimed at Ikai. As soon as Ivan arrived back in the metropolis, a government official confronted him. The individual was taken aback that Ivan had accurately foreseen the precise time and place of the assault without a single error. He even intended to designate 5 operatives to assist Ivan. At that instant, Ivan realized that he had come under scrutiny. Yet, this was a completely instinctive response. How could a commonplace individual who had been withdrawn for 4 years maintain such an accurate intelligence apparatus? Ivan realized that the officer was likely merely inquisitive, yet the misconception had spiraled beyond control. The authorities might suspect that Ivan had a clandestine global network functioning in his stead. Ivan realized that declining to clarify would simply lead to greater complications down the line. Regrettably, providing a comprehensive explanation would pose even more challenges. The landscape beyond the train window swiftly receded. Ultimately, Ivan was assigned 5 entirely untrained novice agents. The so-called assistance team had, in reality, been dispatched to observe him. He cast a fleeting look at the 5 indistinguishable individuals huddled closely together and promptly experienced a throbbing headache. Did individuals this inept truly warrant the title of agents? The carriage was replete with vacant seats, yet the 5 men insisted on huddling closely, as if they desired every traveler to observe their dubious behavior. Glancing at the anxious newcomer beside him, who was soaked in perspiration, Ivan couldn't help but ponder how such inept agents had ever anticipated that he would be able to retire in tranquility. Thus, Ivan gradually stood upright and commenced instructing them. At your age, following. The locomotive reached the terminal, and the 5 operatives arranged themselves in an impeccable line before Ivan, respectfully proclaiming their readiness to obey his every directive. Ivan gazed at them and commanded in a somber tone. A true operative ought to communicate with accuracy and conciseness, move quickly and resolutely, and hide every authentic motive as profoundly as feasible. Upon hearing this, the 5 operatives were drenched in perspiration. They had never anticipated that Ivan's inaugural lecture would extend for a continuous 18 hours. As the interminable presentation finally concluded, the agents swiftly pivoted and rushed off. It was only then that Ivan exhaled a breath of relief. Dmitri had likely dispatched them to observe him. Ivan had merely utilized their training as a pretext to eliminate the entire inconvenient faction. As he exited the terminal, the vision of Gilsbrews surfaced in Ivan's thoughts. Now he could evade the government's scrutiny while safeguarding a descendant of the hero's group. It was the perfect twofold achievement. Within the terminal atrium, a young fair-haired lady hastened forward, dragging a suitcase in her wake. Her coiled golden tresses and functional journey attire instantly indicated that she was a youthful aristocrat. Once on the train, she leaned her cheek against one hand, fatigue etched on her features. The male attendant beside her rested a hand on her shoulder and leaned in closer to soothe her. The young lady swiftly lifted her hand and swatted his arm away. Her eyes shimmered with a subtle azure radiance. With a frosty tone, she retorted, "Be silent, you inept simpleton." She then irritably commanded the attendant to depart, asserting that she no longer wished to encounter him. Observing his retreat in humiliation, she softly whispered, "Fool." Ivan re-entered the train and discovered the compartment filled with commuters. The train had left St. Madalena. It was an express service heading straight to the capital. Given that the route skirted the Demon Front, nearly every halt along the journey served as a significant military bastion. Ivan reclined next to the window, his chin propped on one hand. This was also the reason why the expedition was improbable to be tedious. The complete pathway comprised 30 stops, yet merely 3 sites were deemed appropriate for a terrorist assault. The initial segment proved to be an ideal location for a surprise attack, yet the whole expedition remained tranquil. The following segment was enveloped in shadow, rendering it perfect for an assault by horseback marauders. Nonetheless, nothing transpired. In spite of this, Ivan maintained one hand firmly clasped around the handle of his firearm, with his fingertip gently poised on the trigger. The locomotive swiftly approached the concluding segment of its voyage, and an icy surge of lethal intent subtly permeated the compartment. The majority of the travelers were starting to doze off, yet Ivan could distinctly perceive the pervasive aura of threat, and still nothing had transpired. Was this not meant to be the typical configuration for a terrorist assault on a train? The initial phases of an academy narrative typically adhered to a similar foreseeable blueprint. Would this realm be entirely distinct from a traditional academy narrative? Did this cursed realm of imagination even possess an inevitable conclusion? conclusion. If every conclusion was solely tied to the main character, he could confidently return to his original realm after witnessing the narrative unfold. But what of Ivan? What fate awaits the realm the main character forsook? Ivan had grown thoroughly weary of it all. He no longer wished to stay ensnared in this cursed realm of imagination. He longed to go back to the location where he genuinely fit in. The yearning surged intensely within him as numerous simple pleasures raced through his thoughts. A cozy bed, video games, and Korean series. This primitive realm lacked contemporary conveniences and provided almost no amusement. Ivan had suffered more than sufficient. Abruptly, his image in the train window shattered as the glass burst inward. Fire swiftly engulfed the entire carriage. The train trembled fiercely from the impact of the shockwave, hurling passengers in all directions. A blazing orb shot into the heavens as the whole locomotive was obliterated. The train descended from the raised viaduct, its compartments contorting and warping upon collision. The fair-haired young lady from earlier shrieked in fear as her form plunged with the crumbling carriage. Ivan sprang from the out-of-control vehicle, executing a flawless somersault through the air, and promptly commenced his mission. His form swiftly navigated through the descending carriages and fragmented wreckage. Ivan realized that the instructional sequence had not concluded and that his previous forecast had been accurate. Despite the advancements that had transpired, a single aspect remained constant. The inevitable conclusion was still in place, and Ivan was compelled to confront whatever lay ahead. The gorge lay strewn with remnants of the train disaster, as the lingering embers slowly diminished and extinguished. The fair-haired young lady was coated in grime and struggled to stifle a pained moan. She gradually lifted her eyelids, evidently still bewildered by the abrupt detonation. Her male attendant, however, had endured significantly graver wounds. Without a moment's pause, Ivan retrieved a vial of emerald restorative elixir from within his coat. He extracted the stopper. Ivan subsequently doused the elixir directly onto the attendant's injury. The agony compelled the man to shriek and disclose every concealed monetary secret related to the nocturnal faction. He even implored Ivan to end his life instead. Isabelle was so taken aback by what she heard that she struck the servant in the face. 50%. The man's visage quickly became swollen, while his gaze lost clarity and his awareness began to dissipate. Abruptly, he called out for his mother like a terrified youngster. Ivan scowled and clarified, "The shock from the potion led to cognitive regression, and your blow exacerbated the situation. That second aspect falls on you, so you ought to seriously contemplate your actions." Ivan then stood upright and gazed towards the shadowy silhouette of the distant mountains. The adversaries concealed there should reveal themselves now. Yet Isabelle promptly unsheathed her sword and obstinately insisted on participating in the fray. Ivan cast her a fleeting look and acknowledged her remarkable aptitude, but asserted there was no necessity for her to play the hero at this juncture. Noticing her fiery temperament, Ivan tucked his hands into his pockets and remarked nonchalantly, "You've inherited your demeanor from your mother. You're nothing like your father." Shortly after, Ivan instructed the survivors to ignite fires for warmth and dismantle the carriage seats to utilize as makeshift beds. The cannon proved to be considerably colder at night than any of them had anticipated. At this moment, he needed to confront the idiots lingering in the mountains. It became evident that Ivan had gazed at the nocturnal heavens moments before and recalled a phrase from an antiquated strategy guide. During his formative years, he had perpetually regarded the assertion as overstated. It was only after enduring numerous life-threatening confrontations that he ultimately grasped its genuine significance. The adversary would consistently strike from the most challenging perspective to safeguard. Thus, every circumstance needed to be tackled with the direst potential result in mind. After the train went off the tracks, the survivors' instinctual reaction would be to disperse and escape. The adversary had evidently foreseen that reaction. Consequently, Ivan declined to flee. Instead, he ignited a large fire and intentionally revealed his location. This compelled the adversary to summon back the troops who had dispersed in search of the remaining individuals and reorganize for a unified encirclement. Once they assembled and finalized the arrangement, Ivan would possess the ideal chance to launch a counteroffensive. He firmed his hold on his firearm and quietly recited the maxim to himself: "Anticipate the worst, then make the appropriate choice." If the adversary perceived him as quarry, Ivan would demonstrate who the genuine predator truly was. He elevated his firearm, readying himself to unleash a formidable retaliation. Ivan was employing the eradication unit firearm marksmanship approach, a tactical method specifically crafted for precisely this type of scenario. The subordinate troops wielding torches persisted in surveying their surroundings, utterly oblivious to the fact that Ivan had already locked onto them. A gunfire abruptly echoed, and the individual at the forefront instantly crumpled to the ground. Just as Ivan anticipated, the remaining adversaries consolidated their formation and moved forward toward his location as a unified entity.